made me think of a funny story, which was I was in Toronto recently for work and I rented a car and it was late at night and I had the option to choose a Tesla or a minivan.
Oh
And I
boy.
chose the minivan, not because I have anything against Tesla, but I just am not familiar with the driving of a Tesla. I know that it's a little bit of a different experience. I know it has more features that I don't know how to operate. So I drove the minivan around Toronto. If anybody saw me out there, no, you didn't. But I thought about that. There wouldn't have been any explanation on how some of those systems work if I had rented, a car with more ADAS features. And so I think I don't have an answer per se, other than those are conversations that need to be happening right now.
Hmm.
It's, I think, a missed opportunity if they're not,
Hmm.
not only for consumer confidence, but also just road safety in general.
Yep.
And I know that there's certainly information in the owner's manual of these vehicles, but I would wager that very few people are, reading through that unless there's a warning light or something that's going on. So that's something that I think PAVE looks to get more involved in. We recently started working with AMVA, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. So I think as we can build more relationships with some of these other groups in automotive, we can start to work on some more consumer education.
Get ready for a dynamic episode of Features Talk.
Hello, LinkedIn fam. I am so excited to be back for another episode of the Features Talk podcast live on LinkedIn. And we are, as always, breaking down vehicle technology that is meeting everyday drivers. And so I am your host, Lisa Bailey. And joining me, as always, is our resident automotive product specialist, Luke Versput. Welcome back, Luke.
Hello. More Features Talk. I'm ready. Let's do it.
Yes. And today we are calling this episode The Gap Between Hype and Reality. So, what the public should really know about ADAS and autonomous vehicles, because let's just get honest about this. There is a lot of noise out there. And from viral videos to so-called self-driving cars, we won't go off on that tangent, to heated debates about safety and control. Today, we're going to cut through that confusion, and we have a special guest that's going to help us do that today. And she does it every single day. And we have Caitlin Magny Miller joining us today from PAVE. She is the Director of Communications, and PAVE stands for Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. And so it is a coalition of industry, nonprofit, and academic institutions that are really working together to educate the public about automated vehicles. And in her role, Caitlin leads the development of communications and media strategies for PAVE's public education and outreach programs. She's also serving as a board of directors and heads the marketing efforts for Women in Automotive Technology, which is a diverse group of female subject matter experts who are very passionate about driving and advancing the automotive and new mobility industries. And so I am so excited to have you join us today. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with our community today, Caitlin.
Thank you, Lisa and Luke. I'm super happy to be here. At PAVE, I moderate our PAVEcast, which is a podcast about all things PAVE. So it's fun to be on the other side of the table today and chatting with you too.
Yes, I know. It is nice when you can get on the other side of the seat, right? When you just get to sit in and give your feedback. So I am super excited to jump right in. Before we get started with all of our questions that we have today, I want to do an icebreaker question. And so my question for you, Caitlin, is you've been in the trenches of public education and automated vehicles for quite some time now. And so what is one of the wildest or most surprising misconceptions that you've heard from the public?
Oh gosh, this is a tough one. The other day, I was getting a new phone And as you know, when you get a new phone, it takes a little while for your info to transfer over to the new phone. So I was chatting with the sales representative, and we really got to know each other over the course of like an hour. And we talked about what I do for work, and I explained, as I do to many groups of the public, what I do and sort of the basics of AVs. And
Yeah.
this person said, absolutely great intentions, wonderful guy. He said, well, AVs could not, react faster than a human, if there were something to, if like a deer ran into the road, no way could an AV react faster than a human. And I was like, maybe you have lightning fast reflexes, but
Right.
I don't. In fact, AVs can see, around the 360 degrees around the vehicle 24/7 and can react almost instantaneously. So I'll give you that example just top of mind because it was kind of wild to have that conversation, but a teachable moment.
It was.
So
I bet it
yeah,
was. And that is the cool thing about AVs is that because there's such a gap in knowledge of really the capabilities of an autonomous vehicle and even the driver assistance systems that are in cars today, it's very interesting when you have these conversations with people that are in the public as to what they think these systems can do, and then to see their mind blown, at how fast these technologies can react faster than a driver. So I love that. I love that. And it's a teachable moment. And it kind of brings you down to reality too of what the public understands and how we can better improve the education to really bring them up to date. And so that actually segues right perfectly into the beginning. I want to lay the foundation. I want to do like let's define the landscape first before we get into some deeper questions. And so, Caitlin, let's start with the basics. What is the difference between an autonomous vehicle and a car with driver assistance systems like ADAS?
sure. Great question to sort of lay the foundation. So as simply as I can put it, an autonomous vehicle or an AV can operate itself without human input, and a car with ADAS, advanced driver assistance systems, requires an attentive human behind the wheel. ADAS and AV technologies use a lot of the same sensors and a lot of similar technology, but ADAS is really supporting the driver, whereas that support is not needed in an AV. An AV is operating independently, and there's a lot of confusion around the difference between ADAS and AVs, and we'll talk more about that as we get into this conversation and how the media has sort of influenced those narratives. But actually it was last year, PAVE and one of our members, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, published a PSA titled Who's Driving, sort of aimed at clarifying the differences between ADAS and AVs, and really honing in on the message that if you're driving a car that you can buy today, you have to be behind the wheel attentively at all times. You can't take a nap, you can't watch a movie. Even if your car is helping you drive and automating some of those driving tasks, you're ultimately responsible for the safe operation of the vehicle. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. And the understanding the levels of automation, I think when you look at that, public education will help the public really understand what you just said. Because there are levels to automation, each level, there is levels that require the driver to participate. And then once you get up to 4 and 5, that's where you're starting to see, the vehicle driving itself. And so it's clarifying that message that a vehicle that you would purchase from a dealer, it is not a self-driving vehicle. And so understanding the levels of automation for consumers is so important. And so my follow-up question to that, Caitlin, is what are the levels of automation? Because I want you to go ahead and explain it. And how should consumers think about it in practical terms? Because that's what we're trying to do with this podcast is break it down to where it's easy to think about automation, and bring it down to a practical level where the everyday driver understands what's happening.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it was 2014 that SAE International a standards organization, established these levels, and they've really been sort of the foundation for describing the spectrum of automation that we know today. So we go from level 0, which is no automation at all the way up to level 5, which is full automation under any condition. And I like to talk about it. I like to give a couple of benchmark examples, like Waymo. A lot of us know about Waymo. Waymo cars are operating at a level 4, so they can drive around themselves without human intervention, but they are restricted to a certain operational design domain, or ODD, as we say. Level 2, like we just talked about, is more of your sophisticated ADAS features, where you're still responsible for driving, but your car might brake in an emergency. That's called automatic emergency braking, or might be able to do something called adaptive cruise control, where the car can control the speed and the distance behind the car in front of it. I'm dying to get a car with adaptive cruise control because it sounds like such a nice feature.
It is wonderful.
Thank you, Luke.
It's wonderful. I usually don't drive an inch on the freeway without it. It's really fantastic.
Yeah. I'm a couple years behind in my personal vehicles. I just got a backup camera. So I'll get there eventually, but yeah.
That is so funny.
You'll love it. You'll love it when you do.
Yeah. But about the levels, I think given what I've said so far, it feels pretty clear, but there are some tricky spots to it. Level 3, for example, is considered conditional automation. So the car can sort of drive itself under certain conditions, but the driver has to be ready to take over. And the idea, I think, of articulating the rules of level 3 to consumers is something that is going to become more difficult as we see more level 3 systems on the market. I know right now they're sort of limited to a few geographical areas, but I think that's going to be something that we have a lot more difficult conversations about in the next few years. Level 5 is also an interesting conversation because level 5 suggests that a car can drive itself under any ODD, but I like to say, like, even as humans, I, as a driver, have an ODD, so level 5 seems kind of crazy to me too. But those are the levels in a nutshell. Level 0, you don't have any automation. All the way up to level 5, you've got full automation. And those are really the foundation for how we describe AVs. Now, whether or not the public should be expected to understand those levels, I think, is another conversation. I think in the industry, we talk a lot about the levels, and that feels very clear and easy to us. But when we think about public education, consumer education, I think that's sort of open for discussion.
Yeah, it's that fine line between the technical side of AVs and then bringing that down to the public level. Like, how much information is too much information? And so, especially like for Features First Auto, when I think about this, the public, even myself, the way that I think is, if I can understand the basic foundation as to what we're talking about, then it makes it a little bit easier for me to understand the levels. And so those levels, understanding level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not going into depth about it, but just understanding the basic understanding of what those levels mean is going to be helpful to the public, because it allows them to structure their expectations around what the vehicle can and cannot do. And so you mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of marketing language that is floating around, and especially with self-driving and autopilot. And so that plays a huge role in the human perception of what these vehicles are capable of doing and not doing. And so my question to you, Caitlin, is how much does the marketing shape the public's understanding of AVs and ADAS?
I think that's a really good question. And I don't want to hate on marketing because I have a marketing background and I love it, but I think it matters a ton. Words matter. And education is really important in this space, especially as we see, well, I guess social media has really already proliferated all of our worlds, but it makes it easier for information and sometimes misinformation to spread quicker than it has in the past. And it can create a lot of confusing scenarios. I don't want to call anybody out, but saying a system can drive itself fully maybe implies a higher level of automation than a system can provide, especially for a car on the market today. And I think that mismatch has really led to some concerns about misleading consumers and potentially misusing the technology. We did PAVE and AAA and a few other groups several years ago did something called Clearing the Confusion, where we looked at sort of unifying terms for ADAS features. And we found that manufacturers use as many as 20 different names for a single feature. So I think it's an opportunity for the industry to really look at what sort of words and what language are using to describe things and make it as seamless as possible for the public so that we can all be on the same page. It has to really be a team effort, I think.
100%. And I love that you brought up the clearing the confusion, because we're currently working on a special project. Typically we work with, our business clients with developing training for their fleet and the different technologies, but we want to reach the public as well. So we're working on a special project, and it's being built around clearing the confusion document. It's
fascinating.
Yes. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up, because you are absolutely right. And when you think about like the marketing perspective of vehicles, back in the day, when I say back in the day, 4 or 5 years ago, when you see a commercial, it's like, you're going to have the new BZ5, ZX, whatever you want to call it. And you're looking at the commercial and you're like, oh yeah, I want that. That's exactly what I want. And so at that point, it was okay to market vehicles like that, because they were not as tech savvy, and they were tech savvy, but it wasn't really important for the consumer to know every single level of the technology that was operating in the vehicle.
Yeah.
But if you think about the vehicles that we have today that have driver assistance systems in there, that some of them are active, right, and some of them are passive. So some of on their own, you would never know they're operating, like automatic emergency braking, unless you really need it. But then you've got lane keep assist, you've got steering assist, that's giving this experience of, oh, the vehicle is driving itself because it's communicating with me and it's turning the steering wheel. And so now the conversation becomes, how do we explain that to the consumer, that this is not self-driving, and when does that conversation happen? And so I love that you said that it is a collaborative effort, because now it's being looked at the marketing level. How does a marketing team, we know they want to meet metrics, we know they want to sell, but there's also a safety aspect to it now. So how do we get the marketing team? How do we get the dealerships? How do we get, major stakeholders that are contributing to this ecosystem to start to talk the same, to start to share the same message?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Luke.
I was just going to say the marketing thing is an enormous thing. And especially, from the standpoint of, day to day, like talking to people who are coming in with different, at the dealership level for myself, like with different levels of knowledge of these features, what they're called, what they can and can't do. When you mentioned, Caitlin, about how moving forward, there will be an opportunity here for the industry at large, for marketing departments, for on the engineering side, everything, to kind of like, you use the term, kind of get on the same page about, what are the terms that are most effective, what will be retained, what will best represent the actual functionality and limitations of these features in the real world. And 20 different names for one feature isn't exactly on the same page, and it's amazing to me. Across multiple brands now, just how many different pages people are coming from when they come to look at a car and they ask, does it have this? Can it do this? Does it have this feature and all this? It's amazing how many different pages that people are coming from. And that, so many times on test drives or even just talking about them verbally, so many customers have asked, does it drive itself? And I know in the back of my mind, they don't actually mean can it 100% drive itself? Like you could remove the steering wheel and it would be fine. I know they don't mean that. What they generally mean is, does it have smart cruise control? That's
Right.
that's generally what people mean. I think most people are pretty aware that there is no truly, at least that can a consumer can buy and register on the road, a truly full self-driving car, level 4, level 5. And only a couple times have I ever had someone ask, what level of automation is this? Like only like once or twice in the past 8 years. So is this level 3? Is this level 2? That's pretty rare. But so many different things. I mean, does this have autopilot? Does this drive itself? Can it do this or that? There's a lot. People are coming from so many different pages, talking about wanting to get us all on the same page. That will be very, very important for one. It'll actually help the companies, I think, be more profitable because they'll be able to, the less confusion for them, the more they can sell their product. But also, it will be most important, like where we're getting at is the actual consumers and how they use it. It'll be important going forward, and that's why like Pave and all the stuff that they're involved in is really good, because clearing that confusion is a huge thing. And like you said, the collaboration between those organizations is very important. And I'm hoping that there will be more standardization of terms for the different for all those different functionalities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another area that I don't have a ton of experience in, but I'm curious to get into a little bit more, is driver's education. I took driver's ed when I was 15, which was over 15 years ago now.
Right.
And I remember the pizza party at the end of the program, and that's about it. Like, how can we engage younger drivers so that they're more prepared to make these decisions and have better understanding of what their cars can do as their drivers? And then similarly, when we talk to a lot of adult and older communities who have some hesitation around the technology, how can we really highlight the safety benefits of those ADAS features so that they're not like, I want to turn off this beeping, when really it's like, well, that's actually part of a safety feature that is really valuable. So
the number of times I've had that conversation. Couldn't even count the number of times I've had that conversation.
It shows the necessity of the education, and you are absolutely right, Caitlin. We just did our mom's edition of the Feature Talk podcast, and so I had me and another mom on there, and we were talking about driver's education. And so the trainings that we develop, we are actually talking to driver training schools and trying to bring this as, supplemental curriculum, saying, because they're learning the rules of the road, which is very important. But often, if you think about driver's education, even the fleet is kind of outdated. The cars they're driving in is going to be very different than what they have now. And so bringing this conversation to driver's education is 100% what we're doing. And it's so important that organizations like yours are in those areas, because it's reaching those teens early before they get into the car and assume that this is self-driving. Because we talked about that in the mom's episode, and her son found that the car had steering assist. And he told his mom, he's like, Mom, do you know this car can drive itself? And she's like, oh, no, it can't. And he's like, yes, it can. You don't know. No. She's like, I do know. And so she had to have that conversation in her driver's ed, talk with her son about steering assist and what steering assist is. And so I think about that collaboration like we've been talking about. And I have a question for you, Caitlin. How do you see dealerships playing a role in ADAS consumer education when you think about the point of purchase, right? The point of sale, and even renting a vehicle that has driver assistance systems in it? And typically, you have the, company's representative come over and go over a few things with the car, but there's not really a conversation happening about the technology. So how do you even see those players playing a role in consumer education?
You made me think of a funny story, which was I was in Toronto recently for work and I rented a car and it was late at night and I had the option to choose a Tesla or a minivan.
Oh
And I
boy.
chose the minivan, not because I have anything against Tesla, but I just am not familiar with the driving of a Tesla. I know that it's a little bit of a different experience. I know it has more features that I don't know how to operate. So I drove the minivan around Toronto. If anybody saw me out there, no, you didn't. But I thought about that. There wouldn't have been any explanation on how some of those systems work if I had rented, a car with more ADAS features. And so I think I don't have an answer per se, other than those are conversations that need to be happening right now.
Hmm.
It's, I think, a missed opportunity if they're
Hmm.
not only for consumer confidence, but also just road safety in general.
Yep.
And I know that there's certainly information in the owner's manual of these vehicles, but I would wager that very few people are, reading through that unless there's a warning light or something that's going on. So that's something that I think PAVE looks to get more involved in. We recently started working with AMVA, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. So I think as we can build more relationships with some of these other groups in automotive, we can start to work on some more consumer education from the dealer and car rental standpoint.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that a lot. Now, I know PAVE has done a lot of studies. And so, what has PAVE learned about how consumers actually feel about these technologies?
So I'll give you a couple of examples. A couple of years ago, we conducted a public opinion poll, um, and found that almost half of the people we talked to said they would not get into a robotaxi at that very moment. They felt
Mhm.
unsure of it, they didn't trust it. Um, that said, people also indicated that if they had more understanding of how they worked and more exposure to them, that they would be sort of willing to change their minds and be more open to that experience. So I think that really sort of emphasizes the importance of education and exposure, which we talk a lot about at PAVE as really moving the needle on public trust and consumer acceptance. But I was just doing some research for another presentation, and I came upon a recent AAA poll that was done this year that said only 13% of drivers in the US said they would trust riding in a self-driving vehicle, which was crazy to me.
Yeah.
And even crazier is that that was, I think, a 4% increase year over year, which is positive. I mean, that's a
Hmm.
great trend. But still, the majority of Americans don't feel comfortable with AVs. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of work to do, I would say. And of
Yeah.
course, that's probably really geographically dependent, right? My
Yes.
husband and I
Yeah.
recently moved back to the Midwest from San Francisco. He works for Waymo. We took Waymos all the time around the city. It became a part of our daily lives, and it was very unremarkable for, I think, the people of San Francisco. But I regularly talk to people here now in Minnesota, like my Verizon salesperson, like I was talking about earlier, who don't have any exposure to AVs. So we have to remember that not everybody is operating with the same knowledge and is as aware of what's going on.
Exactly.
And we recently did a whole episode actually focusing on autonomous ride sharing. Um, and we talked a lot about how what kind of technology goes into that. How does an existing vehicle become that? Like, how do those vehicles become Waymo vehicles? We had a whole thing on that, and it was and one thing me and Lisa were saying, well, at some point we need to do some kind of like features first special where it's like Lisa and Luke's first time in a Waymo, because we haven't been in one yet.
Yes.
We
We are
You haven't
planning
been in
that.
a Waymo.
No,
Oh
haven't
my
been in one yet.
gosh.
we are definitely planning that because you are absolutely right. It's there geographically, there is areas that people don't even know about AVs. They don't,
Yeah.
they really don't know much about, autonomous vehicles. But here's what I will say: they watch the news. They watch the news, and so there are, and this is, we talked about this in the rideshare episode, is there have been some notable incidences involving AVs,
Oh yeah.
and having that, public misunderstanding of the vehicle itself and the technology, and then not really knowing where to put your expectation. Because we talk about this, is that technology has to be trained. These vehicles have to have road time. These vehicles have to be trained. They have to learn. There's cameras, there's sensors. And so that means that there is going to be some, I don't want to say like, and maybe I should ask you, Caitlin, what's the right word? Because it's not that the technology is malfunctioning, but, no, what do you say when there is an incident involving an AV? It's not necessarily that the technology is malfunctioning, but is it that it's in taking in new information that it needs to process? Because I think that plays into the public perception of the technology. They see an incident, they say, oh, it doesn't work. I don't ever want to get into that, and so they don't understand the part that the technology is being trained. And so now the technicians are back at the table looking at what happened. How do we improve the technology? How do we make it better? And so that misunderstanding that happens with the AVs, what is your take on that misunderstanding? And is that an indication that we need to do deeper public education?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think some media narratives have created a tough situation, and I can understand the goals of a media outlet wanting to create a story and get as many eyes on that story as possible. But it has created a tough environment when it comes to building trust and building acceptance. And I think to what you said about, a scenario like an edge case, for example, causing sort of public outcry. I think AV companies are going to be held to a higher standard from a safety and a transparency standpoint. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? I will say PAVE convened something called an AV safety info share, which is modeled after aviation. And we talk about how when you get on an airplane, you really don't think about the safety of it. You just assume that you're going to be fine because for several decades, the aviation industry has built up this trust and safety in commercial flying. And so we convene this info share where safety professionals from the leading AV companies and suppliers and developers come together and talk about their safety concerns and talk about solutions. And I can tell you confidently that this is sort of a buzzword saying, but they're not competing on safety. It's really cool to see the industry work together and work out problems that they've encountered and offer solutions to each other. So I think the idea that, these companies are working together when it comes to safety, and that it's in everybody's best interest for all of these companies to succeed in from a public perception standpoint is important to remember.
Yeah,
exactly. Like with all the the whole point of with all the competition in the market, it's one of those things where there's always going to be competing products for in a lot of ways, but for things like that, the companies coming together and comparing notes will ultimately make all their products better. So that,
and you said something key, Caitlin, the transparency. That's something that we've talked about. Me and Luke have talked about this, is what's happening in between the accident we saw on the news and the updates that have happened to make sure that doesn't happen again. Right. That conversation is lost to the public. And the more that we can take the journey with the OEMs and the engineers, and the more that we can say, you know what, yes, we saw this, but now this is what we've done to update the system. And now we're back testing. That conversation is so important for the public to be brought into that process of improvement. But then there's also the responsibility on the public side to understand this is not going to be a perfect journey. And so there's setting that expectation, because I'm telling you, in all the years that I've worked in technology and developed trainings for the end user, there are some unrealistic expectations that we as the public put onto technology. We just assume it's going to be perfect, that there will never be anything wrong with it. And that perception is hurting us, especially when we think about autonomous vehicles and we see some of these incidents that are happening in the public where, the vehicle, it had an address to go somewhere and it didn't go there. And so maybe it stopped in the middle of the road or whatever it was. It's really filling in that gap of the conversation of what's happening. And I know that, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, they have public campaigns about this as well as paid, trying to really bridge that gap. But I do think that it's going to be very important that we're looking at where that information is being filtered to. Who is actually having access? Is this getting to the public in these areas that know nothing about autonomous vehicles? And so, like you said, if you think about San Francisco, I can tell you anybody that lives there, they probably know about autonomous vehicles, and they probably know way more than someone that is in a completely rural area. And so I see, for the future, even with the collaboration, but also making sure that the information is reaching the public, the mass public. And everyone is kind of saying the same thing, but they're showing that there are improvements that are being made. That is so important. Because we need to see the growing pains. The public needs to know that there are growing pains and that this is par for the course. Like, this is part of what is part of the journey. And I just think that that's not talked about enough. I think that might be a missing link, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think from my perspective, I feel like the industry as a whole has done a better job in the past couple of years of really being transparent in their safety case. You see them publishing their safety case frameworks. You see them, sharing the results of independent audits. You see them doing voluntary recalls over fairly minor infractions. And I think they're really working to build that public confidence. Now, not everybody is seeing that, and not everybody is, has a Google alert for autonomous vehicles in the news like I do, and is, reading about them all the time. So making sure that the public, especially in more rural or suburban areas, has a more holistic view of what's really going on, and kind of cutting through the media hype is tough. And it's something that we all need to work on as an industry. And it's gonna be a journey, I think.
Yeah, that's something I brought up in a previous one of our episodes. I normally have, a consumer tip or a few or several sometimes that I always like to kind of like as a send off or as part of the podcast. And one of the big things was it wasn't on our autonomous ride sharing episode. It was a different one, but one thing I just kind of wanted to make clear to everyone is that, in the presence of whether it's watching the news or more commonly just having a news feed, right? Right in front of you, because just about everyone has one, and that is often catered to them. It's unfortunately it's the incidents that make headlines and can get the most views and clicks and whatever. But the thing I always tell people is try not to let what you see on your news feed either. Just don't let it be too black and white. Don't let it make you too complacent that nothing will ever go wrong. But also don't let it make you think that it's so bad it will never get better. And that's one thing I kind of wanted to make clear to the viewers is that if you don't see any headlines about any accidents or not even accidents, but just any malfunctions or any of those growing pains in autonomous vehicles, whether it's ride sharing or otherwise, don't assume then that there's no work to be done, that there's not still improvements. But then if you see something that, if you see a headline of oh, there was a malfunction, there was an accident or something, yeah, it should give one pause, and it does. But also, I would advise people, just to kind of reiterate, don't let that make you think that it won't get better and that it's not going to get better. Don't let the few represent the many in that case. Way more good things happen with autonomous vehicles than negative things, and in the development. And so that's also kind of this topic. I would just reiterate that, just understand it's for people listening, it's a developing process. There's going to be growing pains, and don't let a negative headline or two make you think that it's doom and gloom.
I think something that people don't consider, and I bring this up a lot when I do sort of public engagement work, is the crisis that is road safety today.
Yeah.
I think over 40,000 people every year in the US die on our roads. And to think about or to acknowledge that humans get distracted, we get sleepy, we drive impaired, we get road rage, we're not perfect, is sort of a tough pill to swallow. But I think it's important to acknowledge that that's really one of the main, that's sort of the North Star of AVs, right? Like they have the potential to really improve the safety of our roads. And so when I talk to people and say, we actually, have you considered, how unsafe humans can be at driving, it sort of flips a switch and leads to an interesting dialogue, which I hope is valuable.
Yeah, just like you said, someone who didn't think that an AV could react faster than a human.
Yeah,
But
exactly. So the work is going to take place in conversations in Verizon stores and in large public events too. It's going to take a bit.
yeah, it will.
You are absolutely right. One of the things, especially when I first founded this company and really trying to bridge the knowledge gap of ADAS and seeing the importance, that came from me teaching my son and me having a lack of resources around that. That spoke to him in his language. Teenagers, they learn differently. And so, and a lot of the times I am presented with the question as to why are you doing this? Why? And I give them that statistic of how many people we are losing on our public roads every single year. And it sets the tone every single time. Because if you think about, driver assistance systems, I wouldn't even say they used to be, because they are still, when you go to purchase a vehicle, it's, some of them can be part of a higher trim. So you're purchasing them, it's seen as luxury, And so now it's shifting that conversation, especially now that some of them are becoming standardized. So now we have our government involved, and they're looking at the technologies and they're saying, listen, there are statistics, there's data backing these technologies, and they're reducing collisions or the risk of a collision. And now you have the insurance companies looking at it. Obviously, they have a vested interest in driver safety, but this is a different conversation now that we are having. It's not just, oh, let me purchase the higher trim, let me have the best technology. It's, this can potentially improve my chances of going from point A to point B safely. That is a different conversation now that we're having. And now full understanding is needed, because now it takes the participation of the driver. And so you're absolutely right with laying those statistics down and letting the safety aspect of these technologies speak for themselves, because you have the drivers that say an AV will never drive as good as I can drive. Of course, we're like, prideful people. We think we can do it until you put that data in front of someone and you say, how many drivers are driving distracted on an everyday basis? I can't tell you the amount of drivers I see at the red light on their cell phone. I cannot tell you the amount of drivers that I see sitting at a green light because they're still finishing a text message. And I know they're on their cell phone because they're sitting at a green light. And so these are the conversations, I think, at the public level that need to happen. It's not just the conversation of the AV and the technology and what's right and what's wrong about it. It's also the public responsibility when we think about safety and safety on our roads. And that has to be part of the conversation. And that collaborative effort that we were talking about earlier with getting everybody involved in the conversation is very important. And so, Caitlin, I have a question for you. For someone buying a car today, what are the top things that you think they need to understand about the technology that they're getting? Especially considering the fact you said you just got a backup camera, so you can see that, but there's like so many more levels to this thing. So
Yeah.
I know. I actually, my mom has a nicer Audi hatchback, which is just a joy to drive. And about a year ago, I was driving it sort of a long distance, and it gave me sort of a phantom emergency brake. There was nothing there. It was like on the road, just open road. And it was terrifying, but I just hadn't even considered that that car might have that advanced safety feature. And even as somebody working in the industry, just I wasn't tuned into it. So yeah, I mean, consumers really need to understand what their vehicles are capable of. I think first and foremost, I'd go back to the message of our Who's Driving PSA, which is that if you're buying a vehicle right now, even if it has ADAS and sophisticated ADAS, you're still responsible for being an attentive driver when you're getting from point A to point B. And I think then after that, you really need to understand what safety systems you have, what they're sort of what they're designed to do, so that they don't try to turn them off, right? So that they can use them to their benefit, so that we can all be safer on the road.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest things we come across in our trainings and working with some of our business customers is the drivers wanting to turn them off.
Yeah.
The beeping is too loud. So let's lower the volume. I had a driver say, well, let's just lower the volume altogether. And I said, okay, well, then now we're defeating the purpose of the technology because it is trying to inform you of something. And so that is one of the main things that consumers are doing right now. They are turning them off because there has not been a conversation about the safety aspect of it. And that is going to be some data that has to be collected that, we're hoping that we are able to penetrate that in some way with asking drivers, why do you feel the need to turn it off? If you knew what this technology could do, would you still turn it off? Because all of that understanding as to why the human behavior around these technologies, that will help us better understand how we have to shape the education. And then also, how do we hold the public responsible for their participation with the technologies as well? Because you're not getting a regular vehicle anymore. Me and Luke talk about this all the time. You have a computer on wheels. Okay. This is a computer. There's data collection happening, and for good reason. Like we talked about just a second ago, with most of us are driving distracted. I can definitely admit that there are times that I drive distracted, and distracted can mean many different things. You can be emotionally upset about something. You could be crying. You could be just, mentally not 100%. That is distracted driving. You are distracted right now. And road rage is a real thing, and people can be triggered from all kinds of things. And so knowing that there are technologies that are working in the car, even when you are in that state, trying to remind you, slow down, the speed limit is this, and you're going here. Those reminders are necessary and they are important. And so having that conversation around it, that safety aspect, but also holding that responsibility to the consumers is going to be super important. Now, Caitlin, what would you say? How can consumers tell the difference between marketing and functionality?
That's a great question. I think, part of it comes, I think, along with asking questions, thinking critically about what your car can and can't do. I think if you're just receiving marketing information, you might be taking it at face value. But if you can think critically a little bit about what it does and what it's intended to do, that can sort of help cut through the hype. Yeah.
What do you say about that, Luke? Because I know every day you're working with customers, and like you say, you see all kind of customers. Some of them you can tell who's been watching the commercials.
Yeah, there's so many different guys. There's some people that are like, there's some people that like you mentioned, Caitlin. It's not necessarily an older demographic, although it sometimes is. People who are pretty averse to automated safety feature, or no, I shouldn't say automated, but like just more advanced safety features, and want to know like, how do I turn it off? How do I do that thing where it doesn't beep at me or something like that? Other people are they're kind of, some are interested, some aren't. Some are really into it and turns out they have a company called Features First, and then ask me to do podcasts with them. Once in a while you get one of those kinds of customers, but that's a big component is that my day-to-day is seeing is I can tell right away what kind of marketing have people been receiving about this feature or that feature. And I would say, and I've reiterated a bunch of times on this podcast, the importance of seeing and test driving a car, new or used, doesn't matter which one. Seeing a car, test driving it, and especially if it's a new car, if you have, if you're at a place like a dealership that has, like a dedicated product specialist, like what I do, that can actually just explain in practical terms, here's what this can and can't do. That I think is the best way. Um, you know you can do due diligence before you get there to the point of wherever you're buying the car, whether it's private party, at a dealership, anything, whatever the case. um Look up different reviews that, especially from like people that are not affiliated with the automaker,
Hmm.
is always important. Like it's if you're looking at like reviews online, but then especially in person, it's very important to see and feel it in person. And while I would obviously not necessarily, I would not recommend take a car on a freeway and just go full bore towards the back of something to test automatic emergency braking. um I would recommend, find, and this is often pretty accessible right around dealerships, because dealerships often set up shop very close to each other. We
Hmm.
talk about certain things that all companies will kind of agree on that will benefit all of them. Well, they like to set up shop next to each other so that their options are close by. And what that means is there's a lot of roads with lanes and a lot of roads with cars, passing each other. Great places to try out things like blind spot monitoring and lane keep assist. And if it's a long enough road, you could probably even fit in some adaptive cruise control to try out. I've done that on many test drives. There's actually been a place to actually try that out. Um, there have been a couple times I actually got one of the dealership's cars and actually drove ahead of a customer and demoed it for them. And I was like on the phone with them and said, I'm about to slow down now. Make sure your foot's off the brake and you'll feel your car slow down as well. And so seeing it and trying it in person is a great way, I think, to cut through marketing and marketing hype, where marketing can sometimes overblow the functionality of a feature. And especially like you said, especially if the term self-driving gets thrown around a little more liberally than it should.
Yeah. I also want to throw in there too for the listeners that it's very important that you're paying attention to where you're getting your information from. I definitely think that that will set the tone for someone to know whether this is marketing or is this really what I can expect. And so organizations like PAVE, organizations like the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, organizations like the National Safety Council, these are reputable organizations that have the public's interest in mind and the public's safety in mind. So it's also recognizing where you're getting your information, not getting caught up in the hype, right? There's a gap between hype and reality. That's what we're talking about today. And so making sure that you're getting your information from a credible source. And that's one of the things that is one of our goals here at Features First Auto, is that we're not just developing training and we're just getting this information from different sources online. We are partnering with the OEMs. We're partnering with organizations that are developing these trainings to make sure that we're all saying the same thing. So it is very important that, because we got YouTube University, everybody's going to YouTube. Everybody's learning things off of YouTube. And I'm not knocking YouTube, because YouTube, you can learn some great things. But when it comes to your safety, you need to make sure that the person you're listening to on YouTube cares about your safety and less about you buying the car. And so going over some of the features, but not necessarily telling you your responsibility with it and the safety statistics that come with that. And so just making sure that you're understanding where you're getting your information from and that it's credible is going to be able to help a consumer tell the difference between marketing and functionality. And so, Caitlin, where are we headed is the question. So realistically, what can we expect in the next, I say 5 years, when we're thinking about ADAS and in autonomous vehicles? Because ADAS are the stepping stones to autonomous vehicles. The more drivers can experience driver assistance systems and then they're properly trained and educated, the idea of an autonomous vehicle will not be so far-fetched. So what would you say, where are we headed in the next 5 years?
Great question. Kind of a crystal ball question that's really hard to answer.
Yeah,
I'll
look
say
deep within and see where are we going to.
I think we're going to continue to see growth from the robotaxi companies, of course. Obviously, Waymo has made huge strides this year.
Yeah.
Zoox as well, Neuro, a number of these companies. We've also seen some exciting developments this year on autonomous freight. For the first time, we saw Aurora go driverless in Texas without a safety driver.
Oh, wow.
So I think we're going to continue to see some exciting developments there. And I think with that, we're going to see some of these, what were kind of crazy ideas a while ago, become more normalized and sort of become mundane, right? So that's sort of my hope. And I think along with that, we're going to see more public acceptance as well. And I think to your point about ADAS, we're going to see more and more people, you know, buy and use cars with ADAS, which, as you said, is a stepping stone to AV. So if we can demonstrate the safety value of ADAS features, which are some of the same technologies being used in AVs, I think we're going to see smarter, more informed consumers. We're going to see safer drivers and safer roads, and we're going to see more public acceptance of AVs as well. So that's my hope. We can check in 5 years, but yeah, who's to say?
I did see that with Aurora, and I thought that was fascinating, where you start to see the use cases for autonomous vehicles and moving goods and services. And so it's going to be very interesting over the next 5 years. And I completely agree with you. I think that the more the public has access to these driver assistance systems, now that the government is starting to standardize some of them, consumers are not being met with having to spend a whole bunch of money. We talk about this, Luke, with, Kia. Kia is a brand that you can get a fully loaded car for less than 30 grand, with ADAS. And so when we start to see these systems become more standard on vehicles, then the public will have more experience with them. And we will see that public perception and that acceptance. I 100% agree. And I also think, too, that with organizations like PAVE, making the efforts to partner with the stakeholders, the OEMs, and in that regard, that is also going to help with that perception and that adoption and understanding how to structure that consumer education as well. And so I agree with you, and I'm excited. I really am excited to see where we're headed. I mean, technology in cars and automotive, it's a little crazy. I've seen some all kinds of crazy tools, and I'm like, oh my God, what world are we, what era are we in, and so it's going to be a very exciting. And so we have a segment in our podcast, and we like to call it Listener Lane, because we collect questions from our listeners. We want to make sure that the content that we're creating is valuable to them. So we picked out a question that we have for you, Caitlin, that one of our listeners asked. And that question is, what role can we play as consumers in shaping how these systems evolve?
I think that's a great question. I think providing feedback is important. Getting education can feel kind of didactic and like sort of, I'm just giving you information, but I like to look at it more as a conversation, because when I'm telling somebody about AVs and the potential of them, I want to hear what their concerns are, what they've heard, what questions they have, so it doesn't feel like such a one-way street. And I think in order for us all to, get to a point where AVs and ADAS are providing us solutions to transportation and safety issues that we're having, it's important to get the voice of the consumer as well. I also think it's important that consumers not turn off their ADAS features, to try to use them and understand them, and get the resources they need to learn how to use those for their own safety. And also just cutting through the hype or having some critical thinking around the news. When you see a story with some provocative language around AVs, read it and understand where it's coming from. Take a look at the involved companies and what they're saying about it. Sort of think critically and try to make a more informed decision instead of taking a headline at face value.
100%.
Exactly.
Luke, is that not what you said
Yep,
in one of our episodes?
that's exactly what I said. We've talked about the importance of feedback. This was in our autonomous ride sharing episode. This was like that was one of the big things that we talked about. And that I especially went on that was how important feedback is. That how often when we go to I guess the easiest example is a restaurant, right? Like how when you go to a restaurant and the food's, even if it's not exceptional, it's like I'm going here because it's good. I know it's good. I've been here before and it's good again. How often do you go and not leave an exceptional positive review of, well, it was great, it was this and that, like, because like for you, it's like, okay, I expect it to be good. But then, if something is bad, like if maybe it's a place you haven't tried, if you feel that it's the whatever the good or service did not meet your expectations, people often don't leave a bad review. They just don't come back. And it's like, well, that hurts them in some way, but it doesn't really address like what went wrong, what can they do to do better. And any company that really cares about advancing is always looking at what can we do better. Like obviously, like Lisa and I have had a ton of conversations off camera about about Features Talk podcast, about the educational material that we provide and stuff like that. Like how can we make all this better? Because that stuff matters. And so when that Waymo ride comes to an end, whenever that is, like because Waymo is like what most people think of, when that ride comes to an end and you get the inevitable thing in the app of tell us about your experience, how would you rate your experience, that becomes immensely important.
Mm-hmm.
Not just if something went wrong, it's equally as important if it went well and it just got you there with no issues and was, like you described it as, when you get used to it, unremarkable. It still becomes important to leave a good review. And so yeah, as consumers, providing feedback is immensely important for things like this, because that's the most important data that they can get. And also having conversations about it with others, about not necessarily the reviews, but about the technology, about the features and things like that. I mean, that exact thing is how Lisa and I first met when she was getting her car. It was that whole tutorial presentation that I was giving her on her new vehicle. And then I was brought on, as a part of Features First, and then here we are.
Yep.
But like that exact conversation is how we met. And that kind of thing is immensely important, because then you just get other consumers, experiences and their other things. And that's not coming from some kind of carefully curated and worded news headline. That's just coming from someone else has their own lived experiences that can be compared with yours. So that exactly what you said, Caitlin, was almost word for word what we've said. And Lisa, I mean, we've even used the term voice of the consumer.
Yes.
We say that all the time.
Yep. It's important. And so listeners, you have a voice. You can give feedback, and they need your feedback. Just like Lou said, good and bad. You are a part of the process, whether you know it or not. Your buying behaviors are being looked at. And so you are a part of the process. And I think that is a very important aspect that we need to continue to say for the public. They need to know that they are involved and that their feedback matters, because they are helping shape how these technologies evolve and AVs. And so that is a perfect place for us to end it. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us and shedding light on the real challenges and opportunities ahead of consumers in this rapid, evolving world of automated vehicles. Your insights have really helped us feel, more empowered. I know people are walking away saying, oh, I didn't know I had a voice, and they're not so intimidated, by the road ahead. And so to our listeners, remember, automation is not autopilot. The more that you understand what your vehicle is capable of, the safer that you are. And in today's conversation, if it sparks some questions for you, make sure that you're dropping these questions in the chat. We have a link that you can submit questions about ADAS that you have. It helps us to be able to structure the episodes that we have and the experts that we ask to come on here. And so make sure that you are catching up with us on LinkedIn. You're subscribed to our YouTube channel. And we like to say, until next time, drive informed and drive safe. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.